Good evening, everyone. This is our fourth and final day of the Changing Nature of Innovation Conference, hosted jointly by Ahmedabad University and STIER. And we welcome you all today to the session on manufacturing. Briefly going to introduce Professor Chandra, and then he will introduce me later. So this is, I think, the first time the panelist is also introducing the chair. Professor Pankaj Chandra is the Vice-Chancellor of Ahmedabad University. He's been on the board of several firms and institutions, been part of IIM Bangalore as director, and a recent book titled Building Universities That Matter, studies issues of governance, change, and institution building in Indian universities. He's been a very strong supporter of STIER, and thanks to him, Professor Basant, and Sunil Mani and Naushad, of course, we're here today and growing. And really, thank you for all your support and guidance. And over to you.
Thank you very much, Janak. You know, we've really moved quite a bit over the last 4 days. And one thing, as you very nicely remarked a few minutes ago, was, manufacturing was very much central to the conversation in each of the earlier 3 days of our conference. Almost everybody talked about it. And given the situation that we find ourselves now in as around the pandemic, we've all seen the impact, positive or negative, of manufacturing. Let me first throw 3 pieces of data at you. And many of you who've been working in this field would already know that, but just to put this on the table, India's, the contribution of manufacturing to India's GDP has really hovered around somewhere between 16 to 17% for a very long period of time. But equally kind of indicative is the data that we find on manufacturing value add as percentage of GDP. This is the indicator of a measure of manufacturing output as share of country's economy, and that gives a interesting set of comparison. So let me give you a few data points from various countries on the manufacturing value add as percentage of GDP. And I'm using value add specifically because that's in some way, even if it's in a distant way, it talks a little bit about what are the innovative capabilities of manufacturing in an economy. And so the number, as we all would expect for China, it is about, in 2019, that's the data that's available, is 26.7. Thailand, interestingly, 25.3%. Malaysia, 21%. Germany, 19%. Japan, 21%. Vietnam, about 17%. Algeria, 23.8%. South Korea, 25%. The highest for Algeria on manufacturing value add as percentage of GDP in 2006 was 50.05%, ahead of many others. And India's number in 2019 was 13.6%. And the highest that we've ever had over the last decade and a half or 2 decades has been 17.8 or 18% in 1995. So you can see where Indian manufacturing stands. Well, Indian manufacturing ecosystem stands in terms of some of these outcomes. And equally stark is a third data point, which is on the annual growth rate for manufacturing value add. And that's a number for 2019. For Vietnam, it was 11.3%. For South Korea, it's 1.13%. And for India, it's 0.028%. So there are many questions that these and many other numbers throw up in all our minds about manufacturing, and specifically in India, because today we're going to talk a little bit focused on India. And I have, three questions that come to my mind. Is the structure of Indian manufacturing appropriate? I thought I would use the word right, but appropriate is more appropriate. That is the choice of products, sectors, scale, market served, as well as a mix of public and private enterprises. So that's one I want to leave it at the back of your mind. The second are competencies within Indian manufacturing adequate? Skills of people, new technology and equipment, and related productivity enhancing services, R&D investments, and more important, outcomes through innovation. And third, what are regulatory pushbacks for Indian manufacturing, whether it's land, labor, capital availability, and legal system. And the most important question, are they making doing of manufacturing in India extremely difficult? I was just, when I was reflecting on this, interestingly, I thought individuals and firms have moved where these challenges are least. Within the country also, they've moved to sectors that define high tech and use IT, and especially engineering design, or companies have started to move to countries where they find the rule-based governance system of manufacturing that much more convenient for growth and productivity. And in that, there's an interesting similarity in how science and technology research also gets done in India. We either stay with development of theory that requires paper and pencil, so which means you move away from the constraints of experiments and doing and building things, because that's very challenging, or you move to another country that allows for a more easy experimentation and facilities. So and we have two very interesting presentations today, and we're really looking forward to hearing from both our two speakers. So let's get started on this one. I'll follow maybe the format that Ambuj took. So we'll probably go through the two presentations first, and then we'll get to questions. So please type in your questions on the chat box, and we'll take them as we go along. Our first speaker this evening is Nandita Mathew. Nandita joined UNU Merit in November 2018. She obtained her PhD in economics from the University of Pisa in 2016. Before joining UNU Merit, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Santa Ana School of Advanced Studies in Pisa and at the National Research Council of Italy in Florence. All nice places. Her research interests focus broadly on the microeconomics of innovation and development, in detail on firm-level R&D investments, firm performance, strategy, and innovation policy. In June 2017, Nandita won the International Schumpeter Society Prize for the best paper presented at EMAEE conference in Strasbourg for a work on first movers versus first followers. Who performs better? Over to you, Nandita.
Thank you, Professor Pankaj, for the nice introduction. Thanks to Janak and for the organizers for inviting me for this conference. I was very excited. I could watch a bit of the other days, but not all of them. So let me start to share my screen. Let me see if that works. Yes, okay. I think it should be okay. Do you see my screen? Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Okay. So yeah, I will touch upon some of the topics that also Professor Pankaj was mentioning now. Indeed, manufacturing is important. So what I will talk here is about how it matters what a firm produces for the firm and for the country. So as I was introduced, I work micro level, firm level dynamics, but I also try to understand how this micro dynamics shape the macro development of the country, how this is important. So this work is already online. You can find it. It's not yet put in an issue, but you should be able to read it already. It's a work that is co-authored with Giovanni Dosi from the Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna. He was also my PhD supervisor, and Emanuele Pugliese, who's working at the European Commission. If you manage to take a look at the work, I would be happy. So the motivations of the work are three. First of all, it's important, this work, for the economics of development, and then also for the strategic management, for the firm itself. And then we are also in a way testing the theory of the firm. So I will explain this in a bit. Going back to Schumpeter, economic development is a process, as he said, is a qualitative change. It's not about doing more of what you're doing. It's about change. It's about moving to new sectors, moving to new products, the process of creative destruction. So this process of structural transformation, let's say. There have been a lot of works at the macro level, especially in the economic complexity literature, that looks at which are the products that countries produce and where they are going, in the sense trying to predict their growth, and in the same way looking at their growth and looking at the products that they produce, telling, look, maybe you should start investing there, maybe you should start producing there. So let's say this process of self-discovery, as Hausman and Roderick puts it. But in the end, it's not countries that produce products, it's firms that produce products. And that's exactly why we need to look at this from a micro level dimension. And I believe this is one of the few works that started to look at this from a micro dimension to add to this economic complexity literature from this firm level perspective. Also from the evolutionary economics literature, let's say this has strong bearings on the process of capability accumulation, diversification, and growth of business firms, which is in this literature it's called as a core of the macro dynamics of development and catching up. How countries catch up. In the same way, it's also interesting for the strategic management. For a manager of the firm, I want to know if I should stay focused or if I should diversify. If I diversify, do I have improved performance or not? And the next question is, okay, I'm making cars, should I also make trucks? Which is a related product? Can I know which is a related product? Can I understand where I should be diversifying? And these are the questions that we are trying to address here. So with our work, we are able to tell the firms, look, you're doing this, you should be doing this next. And I will explain at the second part of the work how we do this, how we build this measure. And in a way, we are also testing the theory of the firm. So going back to Penrose or Tees, or the capability-based approach, the resource-based or the capability-based approach, the idea is that firms diversify when they have extra resources or capabilities. So this would mean that, okay, then if I'm using some of my tangible or intangible capabilities to make one product also for the other, then maybe related diversification will be more successful for me. Dozy in 1988 pointed out that what a firm can hope to do in the future is narrowly constrained by what we have been able to do in the past. So especially for developing countries or firms in developing countries, it matters a lot of patiently building capabilities in time. I mean, if I'm making pizza today, likely I cannot start making cars tomorrow. So this is the idea. And a lot of works have studied on, let's say, how much firms grow, looking at the growth rates, instead of understanding the process of how firms grow. I mean, and this is what we try to do in this work. To go back a bit to the Penrose versus Tee's idea of resource-based theory of the firm. So what Penrose said was that, so there's a firm, and the firm has this set of resources, and it's making some products. But however, these resources, we need to understand what these resources are. These resources are not physical resources, because if they are physical resources, you could simply trade in the market. What Tees pointed out was that these resources are intangible capabilities that are product specific. So this is not, this part is very much related to what they are doing, or what is the activity within the firm. It could be a product or a service. Here we are talking about products and manufacturing products. Now, I'll get back to this picture later when we talk about the relatedness between products and how we build this measure, because this is important. Because here, what we want to understand is the capability structure behind, or the capability of firms by looking at what they produce. So our first research question is to understand the scope of the firm. I mean, is it good for me to diversify or not? So I start, let's say, looking at the firm performance. We use standard measures of sales growth or profitability. And if we look at in line of the theory that I said now, one would guess that, okay, firm growth, likely if a firm is diversifying, it means that it's starting a new production line. So it's more sales. I mean, diversification could just improve performance. But we look at the empirical results, this is not the case. I mean, it's confounding results since several years, and even a few years ago, some papers find positive results, some find negative results. I will explain why in a bit how we try to solve this problem. It's also true that in line with the theory, if we think about it, the diversification also happens in moments of low growth potential. So I have some excess resources, I have the potential to grow. So it's a tricky econometric problem to deal with. For profitability, one would guess that, okay, I'm moving to a new product, it's moving away from my key capabilities, because what I'm producing now, it's more related to anything that I'm going to start new. So I'm moving away, so maybe it leads to lower profitability. On the same side, we could think that, okay, there may be economies of scope. So, I mean, I'm using some of the inputs that I have now to a new one, so maybe higher profitability. While for coherent diversification, this is our second research question that we will deal with. Like, if I start a product that is related to what I'm doing, do I have firm growth? Will I have an increase in firm growth? Actually, the theoretical predictions doesn't say much about the firm growth, but about the profitability. Indeed, we would expect that there are economies of scope, and so a coherent product basket, which means higher profitability. So the data and the variables that we use here. So while we were working on the data, this was the only data that we had access to, firm level, and we thought this was only one that also had product level information that could be tracked in time, because now I see that also there are some plant level databases that give similar information. So what we use here is Provis database from the CMI. They say that the coverage is pretty good, and the product level information coverage is good, in the sense they cover for 90% of manufacturing firms, which account for more than 90% of total Provis manufacturing and exports. So just to give summary statistics, I mean, a first look at some variables of interest for single and multi-product firms give us a picture that these are different animals. I mean, single product firms are smaller, multi-product firms are bigger, and this is true for also different aspects that you can consider, even R&D investment, exports. So these two are, let's say, separate identities, let's say, separate animals, I would say. So given that, what other works have done? They have looked at, okay, let's see the relationship between firm scope and, or like a single and multi-product status of the firm and performances. I start by doing an OLS and fixed effects. I promise I don't get too much into the technical details, but on the first look, on the first estimation, we see that the results are pretty much confounding. The results are, the main thing to look at is the red, the one marked in red. The single or the multi-product status of the firm with an OLS shows positive effect on firm growth, but the fixed effect shows a negative effect. So it's already, let's say, pretty much confounding, as also other empirical studies have found. However, we saw from our summary statistics that these two are different. So let's see if they're actually different or not. So we run a profit model and we check which are the different characteristics of these two firms. And indeed, they are quite different. And the variables that are significant here also matter for the performance, which means that there is a strong selection problem. And we need to consider this in the estimation. Now, the standard approaches have been done in the literature is to look at the Heckman's treatment effect, which in a way kind of include this. So I'll start giving you a simple example. Maybe this will help in understanding the concept or understanding what we're doing here. So let's say you want to understand the effect of temperature or effect of paracetamol on temperature. So you have a sample of people. Some of them have fever. Some of them do not have fever, and some of them also take paracetamol. Now, what OLS or fixed effect does is to look at the relationship between the temperature and the paracetamol. And likely the people who took paracetamol also have high temperature. So it is possible that these two are positively related, but this doesn't mean that the paracetamol is related to high temperature. Now, this is what OLS or fixed effect does. What Heckman treatment does is to control for this factor, yes, and it gives some kind of a causal identification telling the effect of paracetamol on the average, on the temperature of an average person. But this again is not particularly interesting because what we want to know is the effect of paracetamol on someone who actually had fever. And this is what we do with an endogenous switching model. So finally, after we control for this factor that there are some firms that have diversified and some not, and then you have the performance equation, which is 7 and 8. You have two different coefficients, which, to go back to the fever example, we tell you, okay, so what would have happened to this person if he did not take paracetamol? And this kind of counterfactual story is very interesting. So here we see, for instance, the ATT and the ATU, the multi-product firms, you see that it is, it's the two lines on red below, 0.227, which means that the multi-product firms, if they stayed single, they would have lost 22.7% of growth. And the single product firms, if they turned multi-product, they wouldn't have gained anything. With profitability, what we see is that for the multi-product firms, if they remain single, they would have lost 17% of growth. And the single product firms, if they turned multi-product, they would have lost 14% growth. So in a way, we are saying that, look, firms are not completely irrational. I mean, they know in a bit what they're doing. And at the same time, it also gives a very clear causal effect of this. So in a way, solving also the confounding results that were there in the previous empirical works. So we have a clear relationship, and it's in a bit line with, it is in line with the theory that we discussed. So firms diversify in specific moments, like when they have excess resources, when they have more market knowledge, when they have, so this you need to consider. You need to consider the fact that it's not a random event. They do it in specific moments. And once we control for this, we have a clear relationship. So the next part of the paper, what we try to understand is in which products the firms diversify and how this matters. I mean, here, till now, we just looked at the diversification event per se and the performance. So when you start to measure product relatedness, so there are many works that have looked at the taxonomies or the hierarchical classification, like the harmonized system, right? The 6 digits. So assuming that the products that are in the same sector are likely related. But here, what we want to capture is the capability structure of firms. And these taxonomies are not made to study the capability structure. So there is no reason to think that the products closer in this are necessarily have the firms need same capabilities to produce them, right? So what we try to do here is to do a data-based approach. I will explain how we do that. I go back to the picture that I showed before. So we have this firm which has a set of capabilities and it produces a set of products. Of course, we don't see these capabilities. We just see from our data that there is this firm that produces these 3 products. However, we have a lot of data. So we have all the firms and we know what all products they produce. So the first firm produced the first 2 products. The second firm produced all the 3 products. You see the arrows are to all the 3. And the last firm produced only the last 2 products. There is no firm that produces only the first and the last. And so we infer that these products are not related. So it's basically based on the data that we see. We look at what firms produce and then we infer which are the products that are related. This is an equation. I wouldn't get to explain this, but the idea is very similar to the algorithm is very similar to the Amazon one. So if you buy a product in Amazon, or when you look at a product in Amazon, they show you which are the other products that are related to the product that you're searching. This is because other people who have seen this product have also searched these other products. So the mechanism is very similar to this. You can, what we will finally have is we have relatedness between all the couple of products in the data set. And with this, we can build the coherence of the whole product basket set of the firm by looking at the sales of each product within the firm. I will just tell you how our measure looks like when we compare it to, let's say, a harmonized system, or in this case, the product classification that is there in India. So between 0 to 1 are the product relatedness. So 1 means that it's totally related, so it's a product to itself, while 0 means it's not, it's totally unrelated. I order them according to the hierarchical classification for both in the X and the Y axis. So if the classifications that are available was a perfect measure of relatedness, we would have seen a block diagonal metric. So you would have seen squares. The red line in the middle says that, okay, the product is related to itself. So each product here corresponds to itself. You see that, I mean, we see something of a block diagonal matrix, which means that the measure is not completely random. I mean, there is something that captures. So products within the chemical sector, it's possible that they're related. But there is a lot of signal that we are missing. Firms doing this also do other things. And also there's a lot of signal that we take that are not, that shouldn't be there. To give you an example how this looks like, this is a network that we prepared. This is at an aggregated level. So the one that we actually do in the paper, it's not visible. I mean, we wouldn't be able to understand clear structures. On the right-hand side, I show that the different colors are the different 2-digit sectors. Now, we put a link to the product, which is the most related to the product from where I'm putting the link. So for example, you see here 1302 and 1304, there are 2 products that are in metal sector, which are related to each other. And it's something that you would expect because of course the normal classifications are not totally random. But you see, for instance, on the right bottom, you see a structure, C structure, which is paper products, 904, 903. And you see that there is one product, which is in textiles, that is more related to paper than to textiles, which is jute bags. So the firms that make jute bags, their other products are paper, which makes sense. And this is, as I said, it's at a much more aggregated level, so you don't really see there's much more of these cases, just to give you an idea. Now, from this, what we want to understand, okay, we know the relatedness between products, and we want to, what we may do is to build a coherence of the firm. I mean, how coherent is the firm's product basket in total? And then we see how it relates to performances. As we expected, indeed, it is positive and significant for profitability. So having a coherent product basket is indeed good for the firm. Now, to conclude, why is all this important? So on one side, to go back to the first 3 points that I mentioned, we do test the theory of the firm, and our results are pretty much compatible with, let's say, diversification as a strategic choice to utilize the product-specific capabilities. So you are good, I'm good in doing this, I have some capabilities, let me also start doing something else. Yeah. And also this is nice for strategic management as well, because you understand that, okay, I can diversify, and I do have incentives to do that. And this is very much interesting also for development policy. Why? Now, of course, this mission-oriented programs or much of the industrial policy, they are very much concentrated on, let's say, high growth economies, but it's starting to have traction also in developing countries. So let's say that with macro level works, like the Hosman Hidalgo, for instance, you say that, okay, this country should start, you are doing this, so now you should start doing product Y. Do we have firms to do product Y? We can tell you that, because what is important is we need to have firms with capabilities to do a specific, to start a specific product line, or to start investing in certain sectors. And this is exactly why this kind of work is important, because we know not only which is the plant to seed, but also if we have where to plant the seed. I mean, do we have firms, and which are the firms that have the incentive to diversify that moment. And that's why I think this kind of work is also interesting. We can see, for instance, to give you an example, let's say the World Bank want to invest on greenhousing in India. Do we have funds to do that? Are there firms that are doing related items, in the sense, do we have firms that have climbed up the capability ladder in such a way that, okay, now I'm ready to do this. Now we are ready to enter the sector. So this is how I would say this is important for the economics of development. And yeah, that's it. Thank you. I hope I didn't take too much time.
No, thank you very much, Nandita. I know your paper had many more interesting findings, and in fact, I saw some interesting outcomes which Janak is going to present next, that actually provide evidence for what you found in your own paper. So thank you very much. Our next speaker is Janak Nabar. Janak heads the Center for Technology, Innovation and Economic Research, STIER, and has been leading STIER's research efforts. He has previously worked as an economist and investment strategist in the private sector in Singapore. His work experience includes 2 years with United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in Serbia. His research interests include innovation and technology policy, as well as India's macroeconomic policies. Janak is a member of the CII National Committee on R&D and Innovation. He has been part of working groups constituted by Niti Aayog, including those to evaluate science indicators of publicly funded R&D labs. Janak holds an MA in mathematics from Oxford and an MSc in econometrics and mathematical economics from LSE. Janak?
Thank you very much. I'm going to request Vaishnavi if she could help me with the slides. Just, putting the slides up. So the structure of the presentation, some of it the macro presentation, I think, has already been covered in the introductory remarks by Professor Chandra, but I'll nevertheless go over those, some data from our STIER handbook. Then I'm going to touch upon some work that we've been doing with Rakesh Basant, Pankaj Chandra, Abrar Ali Syed, and Vaishnavi on a survey of Indian manufacturing and some key findings from that. And finally, I'll conclude with just some thoughts around manufacturing in the startup ecosystem. And then we can start the discussion after that. So in terms of the macro overview, we've seen, the share of manufacturing, as Pankaj Chandra mentioned, has stagnated. The output in GDP has been 15 to 17% for almost 2 or 3 decades now. India is the 5th largest manufacturer in the world, as the chart tells us. This is almost comparable to that of South Korea, and about 1/10 that of China. There's an elusive goal. We keep hearing about the 25% being a magic figure. I once asked Pankaj Chandra if this was a goal that he had set, because I first came across it in his National Manufacturing Competitive Council report in 2009. And I think over time, it's somehow fed into policy, and then eventually also the Make in India campaign has adopted that as a goal. But as we see, we've been struggling to even get close to 20% in quite a few years. So one of the ideas, and I just want to touch upon India's R&D expenditure here. We've seen it being talked about in previous sessions also. This too is a figure which has stagnated as a percent of GDP for almost 3 decades now. It's been between 0.6 to 0.9%. The latest figures are around 0.7%. The share of Indian industry's contribution has been gradually creeping up. But if you look at the structure of industrial R&D, it's largely dominated by 2 manufacturing sectors, pharmaceuticals and automobiles and parts. They account for almost 60% of the industrial R&D being performed today. In terms of output, we can see, Vaishnavi, yeah, thank you. So we've looked at data on patents and also the exports and the high-tech component in manufactured exports. So the chart on the left conveys the data on patents that have been granted to the top industrial R&D spenders in India. And again, you find that it's largely dominated now. If you exclude software and services, the share of what manufacturing companies get or the patents that they obtain is less than 20% of the patents that are granted abroad to India, and less than 6% of the patents granted within India. So patents granted abroad are largely dominated by a lot of multinational research R&D centers that have been set up in India. But you also find that patents that are being granted by the Indian Patent Office, it's hugely dominated by non-residents. So firms outside of India are also patenting with, so the actual component or the contribution from India's manufacturing sector, even to the overall patents, is very low. When you look at high technology exports, and this partly reflects the low level of R&D investment, I suppose, that too has stagnated for almost 2 to 3 decades, of 7% to 9% of the total manufactured exports, so the high-tech component. And the high-tech component here, if you were to break it down, is again largely pharmaceuticals, auto components, a smattering of maybe mobile phones, and also some aerospace and defense equipment. And this work, I think Sunil Mani has actually done extensive work in trying to understand the high-tech component of manufactured exports. We now come to the STIER survey, and the question is really why, because this obviously we've seen manufacturing stagnating, R&D has been it's all growing, of course, as GDP grows, but the share has not really increased over time. Many countries that, and there's a very nice article and a lot of work that Naushad has done where he often talks about the contribution of R&D as a share of GDP and how countries like Korea and China that have seen growth for almost 2 to 3 decades of about 7 to 8 to 10%. In fact, you've seen increase expenditure on R&D by the country, but the share of industry within that has increased over time. And so in many other countries, you'll find that the share of R&D is almost 85% by industry, and the balance is performed by government or by higher educational institutions. As I pointed out, for India, it's almost 41%, which is industry and largely dominated by the government sector, and very little by the higher education sector. So the purpose of the survey was twofold, actually. One was that the last survey, I think, which had been done by Pankaj Chandra for the National Manufacturing Competitive Council was in 2008 or 9. There's a general dearth of good firm level data in India today, especially survey data. And this was really to try and see if we could kickstart the process of trying to even work with the academic community going forward to really address the issue. And also, I think it's important for policymakers to do this on a very regular basis, because we need to really understand what is happening at the firm level to be able to dissect what kind of policy interventions are really needed. And so this survey really looks at, it's a deep dive into competition related characteristics, drivers of innovation, innovation activities, capabilities, and barriers to innovation. It was initially, we targeted about 1,000 firms. We got about 906 responses. Cleaning the data, looking for, doing background checks on the companies, we narrowed that down to about 700 plus, of which we then discovered about 200 were plant level and also division level. And so this, at least for today's discussion, we're just going to focus on firm level data. So the findings of about 403 firms. Not really going to go into the sector level analysis or the size. In some cases, I will touch upon if there are any interesting findings at the, depending on the size of the firm. But by and large, the findings I intend to talk about are on the 403 firms as a whole. So the question on competition. The perceived competitiveness. So this question really asks about, how do you perceive your competitiveness vis-a-vis your competitors, both inside India and outside India, on a number of factors, life cycle costs to maybe packaging and finishing. And we find that firms assign the highest ratings to price and quality. They assign high ratings to most other things also. So it is a question on how firms perhaps think of themselves either being better than both their competitors in India, but also overseas. But they definitely assign the highest rating to price and quality, at least within India, and then it's quality outside of India. When you look at the competition and change in competitive pressures, you find that for the firm, the sample of 403 firms, it's pretty moderate, the nature of competition. But for large and medium firms, that competition is high. And for the sample as a whole, they do say that the competitive pressures have increased. And we'll touch upon some of these things later when we try and correlate that with some other findings on the barriers to innovation. But for now, the key takeaway here is that, as you can see from the charts below, the market served, it's largely India for these firms. And you do have some exports to Asia and other countries other than China. You have exports to Europe and North America. And the sources of competition, again, are largely domestic. And what struck us was the fact that, even though it's a smallish sample and distributed across a number of sectors, the competition from China was not, or China was really not seen as a major source of competition. Remember this data, I didn't say this earlier, but this survey was conducted between February 2018 and March 2019, so it was pre-pandemic. And what we found was that, clearly China not being a threat was either because the Chinese firms were in product segments that had been vacated by Indian firms, or possibly that they were being used as intermediate goods for the production of final goods by Indian firms. And the pandemic clearly showed that there was this dependence on inputs from China, both for APIs, for the auto components. So there was some element of dependence. And remember this, at the same time, you've seen China, the imports from China surged from 7 billion in 2005 to over 70 billion. And 70 billion is almost 1/5 or 1/6 of our overall manufacturing, right? So it's not a small amount. I mean, and if firms do not find this as a major source of competition, one needs to really understand what exactly is going on. And of course, I think partly this the new PLI schemes, which are trying to make us less import dependent, perhaps address some concerns about inputs from China, are targeting some of these measures. But nevertheless, I think it really, one needs to study this in further detail to understand what role does China really have to play in our manufacturing going forward. The drivers for innovation, change in market need, competition, drive from top management, are largely seen as drivers of innovation for the firms. You also have sources of innovation ideas largely coming from the top management. This is something which, and the dominance of the top management. So the real question is there a lack of decentralization of idea generation here? I think the first presentation by Ashish Arora had a lot of Nobel Prize winners and scientists, and so did some of the others. So I'm just going to use one story here, which is of the Los Alamos project, where you had Niels Bohr actually, before a meeting with all the top scientists, he called Feynman and he said to him, "Look, I'd like to meet you 10 minutes before we are all actually get together." And Feynman said, "Why me?" And when they met, and he said, "Because you care more about the science than actually saying yes to me. So, I really want to understand from you what you think about this." And I think this really is something which is a culture we need to develop in terms of, and maybe the new technologies will allow that to happen. But I feel if the ideas, we've often heard about shop floor being a source of innovative ideas, or even the R&D people. I mean, that's their job, I suppose, to really track new technology developments and trends. And maybe this is something that firms really need to relook at. The innovation activities. Now you find that there's a preference amongst the firms for conducting long-term R&D and also training for implementation. The literature obviously talks a lot about the importance of training, which holds here. You do find that, especially if you look at small firms and medium firms, there's a preference for market research, advertising, marketing activities, followed by tooling and other engineering changes to start up the new technology. So for the sample as a whole, obviously conducting long-term R&D and training is important, but it really varies across firm size. And then the nature of R&D here, sorry if the numbers are very small, but what we do find is there's a sort of equal distribution over product development, process development, upgradation of technology, and testing activities. And if you consider firms, for example, that obtain patents, there were about 200 firms in our sample that obtain patents. You do find that there's a greater emphasis on product development. This is also true, funnily enough, for some of the smaller firms and medium firms. We find that firms do invest in design-related activities, so that is important. And especially if you look at by firm performance, if you look at firms that increase profitability or even saw improved market share, you do see there's a great emphasis on investments in design-related activities. Touch upon some manufacturing practices. Now, there seems to be a greater emphasis on practices like, so there were about 25 odd practices that we'd asked firms to provide, how much of an emphasis they were laying on each of these. We've just highlighted 2 or 3 of them here. There's a greater emphasis for practices like certification to customers' quality standard systems, computer-aided manufacturing, automated inspection testing, but relatively less emphasis on complex robotic systems or even outsourcing. And artificial intelligence, of course, AI and digital technologies. This is something which, I'm sure the pandemic has, in a way, forced firms to work on that and maybe adopt some of the digital technologies. But at least prior to the pandemic, it did seem that firms were laggards, and been part of various discussions where just terminology was something that firms were not necessarily familiar with. And in a room of 50 people on a similar topic, discussing some of these issues, asked for a show of hands, and maybe 2 or 3 people out of 50 actually said that they were working on some of these or adopting some of these technologies. So we need to investigate this post the pandemic for sure, whether the pandemic has kind of forced Indian firms to adopt these technologies. Again, outsourcing, like I mentioned, is something which we would need to look at. Now, linkages, external linkages. So this recent years, at least in terms of our survey, find is that long-term linkages are there with vendors and suppliers. This compared to the survey that Pankaj Chandra had done in 2009, you do find that back then in that survey, it emerged that these linkages were not necessarily very strong. Today, they seem to be having better linkages with their vendors and suppliers. So something obviously seems to, or perhaps seems to have changed over the last 10 years. The linkages with vendors and suppliers is largely on feedback and quality, on quality and cost, but also, you can see in the chart that they have other connections too, with sharing of testing and production equipment and even training of the suppliers' employees. So this seems to be something which we've, at least comparing it to the 2009 study, that the linkages with their suppliers have improved. Again, with support institutions, we find that this is largely on training and development of employees. Very little, there's also recruitment. So support institutions would be educational institutions, financial institutions, those that might do R&D support for you. And it's largely, again, training and development of employees, but also recruitment for jobs from higher education institutions. Come to innovation outcomes. What we find is that firms, and at least there were less than 50% of firms that actually said they were adopting any significantly new manufacturing technology or production process. Nevertheless, they are upgrading machinery. 60% in this survey have said that they had upgraded. But one really, the question is, when you see this low level of R&D investment, the question is, what is that quality and scale of investment that is happening? And the vintage of equipment here is, we'd asked the firms, what is the age of the equipment on the shop floor? And we find that 50% of the equipment on the shop floor is 10 years or older. Just less than 20% of that equipment is less than 5 years. And so it really begs the question as to what is the quality of that upgrade that is happening. I mean, are they upgrading enough? Are they upgrading with second-hand machinery? If you look at India's import of capital goods, for example, you find that there's been a steady decline over the last 7-8 years. And again, this could be just bad data from the sources that report firm level data, but it's something which we need to really understand as to what is the kind of technologies that are being imported, what is the upgrade and the scale of it that is actually happening at this point in time. So some of the barriers to innovation, and then just the key takeaways from the survey part before I move to manufacturing and the startup ecosystem. The barriers to innovation, I think these are common. Probably you've seen these. I was talking to my dad a little while ago, and he was saying, what you're saying is something I've been saying for the last 20 years. So in that sense, but I said, you didn't have this kind of data. So he said, no. So at least we're able to show it with some data that these issues are still very relevant and need to be looked at very closely. It's excessive regulation, which is a barrier to innovation, insufficient external pressure to innovate, the capital intensiveness of innovation in a particular industry, and the long time taken for innovations to reach the market. And I want to touch upon this insufficient external pressure to innovate, because as we had seen earlier, firms rate their competitiveness on price and quality, largely on price. And given this insufficient external pressure to innovate, the question is, are firms really actually competing on innovation, or is it more price-related competitiveness? And it seems that maybe we're seeing price-related competitiveness from firms, also given the sensitivity of the domestic customer, the focused market being India. It's obviously, it appears to us that firms might be engaging more in price competitiveness than innovation-related competitiveness. So some of the key takeaways have touched upon the price sensitivity of domestic customers, and also the fact that maybe they're engaging in price competitiveness. Firms are obviously very domestically focused. This is something which, if you look at the size of even the large Indian firms, I don't think you'll find too many of them that are globally, could be considered large in global terms. And partly that's, many of them are export oriented, but it's one way to perhaps grow the revenue of the firm is to actually have that exposure to foreign markets also. Decentralization in idea generation is something which is needed. We should also have an emphasis from firms on adopting digital technologies. They are doing the right things in terms of focusing on long-term R&D and maybe training of their staff. And literature does suggest that if you focus on innovation leads to more exports leads to, there's a feedback loop to firms doing more R&D. So there are enough studies out there which look at this, even from decentralization point of view. One of the key things there is that can firms that adopt or are more open to suggestions and from their employees beyond the top management, are they better responsive when it comes to uncertainty? Are they able to withstand shock better? And that's something which, especially in today's day and age, where I think a lot of the technologies are perhaps, even as I come to startups later, maybe many more of the employees and beyond just the top management would be, a source of good technology ideas for firms. The question is, are firms maybe doing more process innovation than possibly product innovation? So as I mentioned, that the upgradation of machinery is happening. So obviously there's some process innovation. We try to look at product innovation. You don't find that, I mean, there are firms that are doing it obviously, but it's not to the extent that they responded to when it came to upgrading machinery. And of course, excessive regulation being a barrier to innovation, which needs to be addressed. I think the authorities are trying to address that through various schemes and measures. But again, you know, things get introduced and then taken away. So if one example is the weighted deduction tax incentive that was there was just taken away without really understanding whether it actually benefited firms or it did not benefit firms. And you know, maybe these are things which the authorities should try and focus on. And in today's day and age, where even funding is constrained, you know, tax incentives perhaps could be directed better to maybe smaller and medium-sized firms. So we need to work on really improving our policy and regulatory environment to support manufacturing. Now I'm going to touch upon manufacturing and the startup ecosystem. And this data really is not about anything to do with manufacturing. Also some work that Pankaj Chandra had done for our recent handbook. So some very interesting insights in that. And this is really about, is there scope for new manufacturing ventures? You know, and we looked at data that was available for the startup ecosystem. This is data from Traction and from between 2015 and 2019. And when you looked at the total amount that came in through VC, private equity, angel and debt funding, that was about 161 billion over that 5-year period. Whereas at the same time, roughly about 55,000 startups had emerged. And we're not saying that all that funding went to those startups alone, but you know, even if you just average it out for these, it's about 2.3 million per startup that emerged over this period. And obviously, if you consider startups that had come in before, that amount is even less. And this is something which, you know, clearly in terms of funding that is needed for manufacturing, for setting up new ventures, is not enough. You also find that there's more emphasis on debt funding and, you know, very little in terms of the early stage investments, which could support manufacturing in a big way. This is some data from Traction again on startup sectors that were attracting funding. You find, you know, a lot of it going to consumer, fintech, retail. Obviously, there are sectors within these. So, for example, logistics tech receives a large amount of funding within the consumer sector, which perhaps would be useful for the manufacturing sector. And also road tech and auto tech, for example. So road and transport technologies that receive funding under travel and hospitality tech here, perhaps also have a role to play for manufacturing. But by and large, you don't really find manufacturing, and this is again just some data on IPO launches in 2021, and you find that many of them are obviously services focused. I think this is interesting in terms of obviously a lot of service innovation. And the pandemic, we needed Zomato, we needed Flipkart and Amazon and firms like that. But we have to ask, what does it mean for manufacturing going forward, especially in India, if funding is going to go towards the software tech? And I think Ashish Arora in his first presentation on day one also talked about how, of course, VC funding was going towards life sciences and software tech, which I think is being obviously mimicked in India too at this point in time. I'm going to conclude just some key points for, I thought, maybe we could, if there are managers sitting here, what would be the key takeaways? So clearly with the firms being very domestically focused, you need to think of new export markets to compete. It should be more innovation driven, the competitiveness, rather than price competitiveness. You need to encourage a wider pool of employees to bring forth ideas whether it's on the shop floor or the R&D team, the adoption of digital technologies. I mean, these are recommendations which everyone knows. It's not something which particularly stands out, but I think the important thing is to keep highlighting these, and hopefully at some point, it becomes mainstream. Now, policymakers need to focus on easing regulatory barriers. I was reading this article just yesterday on the number of, I think it runs into thousands for MSMEs, just the kind of compliances that they have to deal with. And we could see that even in terms of the way the weighted deduction study or the incentive that was introduced in 2009, it wasn't very friendly towards small, medium enterprises that perhaps could not afford to have separate R&D units, and the amount of paperwork that was required to support or just to justify receiving that tax incentive. And many of these need to be really looked at closely if we need to support innovation in our industry. Financing, of course, as I mentioned about the weighted deduction in a targeted way, perhaps being introduced for small, medium enterprises rather than the large ones, because the large firms will be spending on R&D irrespective. And then I would say sequencing of policy measures. So I think innovation needs to be at the core of many of our policy measures. And there are studies which have shown that innovation policy, in fact, has pushed manufacturing firms from, to do, if they were non-exporters, they've been forced to export rather than having an explicit export policy. So, and when I talk about sequencing, it's really, which we can touch upon later, maybe, but when you look at the PLI scheme, for example, there's a huge allocation towards electronics. There's some allocation towards medical devices. We touched upon this yesterday also, that very little funding is going towards the health, public healthcare, R&D, very little towards medical devices. So I think we can grow electronics as an example, focusing on medical devices, given the needs that we're facing today. So I think sequencing of policy, again, even Abhishek Malhotra talked about it in his solar PV policy yesterday. So it obviously is a recurring thing which comes up. And finally, in terms of research questions, I would say that we need to understand, and this is something which it would be great to study. I mean, in terms of the decentralized idea generation, I know when we were discussing this with Pankaj Chandra and Naushad a few months ago, they said, maybe we should look, if the top people are the ones who responded to the survey, then they're going to say it's the top management is the source of ideas. But I mean, the top management hopefully would also understand that it's important to get ideas from the shop floor, if that's what has been recommended in many instances. So so this is something I think it would be interesting to study, and also as I mentioned, the quality and scale of investments being undertaken, because upgrading machinery is one thing, but it's really, are we shying away from the state-of-art technology, state-of-the-art technology? And that's something which would really require surveys like this to deep dive. I think we have a good community of 100 researchers here today. We need to push for these innovation surveys. I know they're there in Europe through the Community Innovation Survey. Nandita, you're lucky to have access to a lot of that kind of data. But I think here we need to really try and make this a periodic thing, and not every 10 years or 15 years. We need to do this on a regular basis. So I'm going to leave it at that, and hopefully take some questions and discuss and really open it out to everyone.
Thank you very much, Janak. That was quite a extensive, I think, picture that you put in place. Before this, I mean, my God, there are so many questions, and I think it will, and that's the exciting part of it. It really shows that manufacturing rocks. It's not in the boondocks. And second, I think these two presentations is just fabulous. in raising such important issues. But before I go to these questions, actually, I want to ask both Naushad and Farhad, you run a very, very interesting, innovative, successful manufacturing company. And I want to hear both of your thoughts, even as briefly as you want. I mean, from your point of view, where does Indian manufacturing stand? And what do you see especially on the innovative part of our firms here? So Naushad, and then maybe Farhad. I mean, love to hear you.
Sure. Sure. Thanks. Thank you, Pankaj. I'll say one thing about us, and then suggest that Farhad talk about it a bit more. And then, it's a history lesson. In 1991, when Manmohan Singh presented his budget, his July 1991 budget, it was a landmark budget. And Farhad and I heard his speech, and within 2 weeks of that speech, we had a series of meetings at work, and we looked at our entire product portfolio, and we asked the question, what would we still make if we could import all of the products that we made with zero tariff? And of course, we could import components also at zero tariff. And we came to the conclusion that about half of our total product portfolio would not be competitive. And so we decided two things then. We decided first that we would invest in R&D and redefine what R&D meant. And second, that we would enter export markets and international markets. And that was an innovation question too, actually, as I'll explain in a minute. So when we decided to focus on R&D, we said, let's stop doing indigenization. Let's stop simply, if it was imported, do it locally. Let's start developing products that we can sell worldwide and that are different to what everyone else does. And those skills took a while to develop. I think it was about 3 years before we got our first product out in that new way. And it was 5 or 6 years before we had enough of a pipeline to then see a regular flow of new products coming out. On the international side, it was the same call. We said, look, the best in the world are going to be coming to India. And if the best way of knowing that we're capable of competing with them in India is if we go and compete with them overseas. So we went overseas really as a way of learning how to compete with firms, with the best firms around. And again, it took a while to learn how to do that. But both of these calls that we took 30 years ago have been, I think, fundamental to the success of the firm over time. And we do benchmark ourselves in R&D terms, that how many R&D engineers do we have? How much do we invest in R&D as a percentage of sales with companies worldwide in our fields? We think we compare pretty well with them. And we especially compare well because actually good engineering talent in India is still available at relatively low cost. And I think this is an opportunity that's available to every Indian firm, and too few take advantage of it. I'll stop there and then turn it over to Farhad. You can't.
I think he may not be a co-host.
Okay. Now I am. Thank you. Thank you. No, I'll just add a couple of things to what Naushad mentioned. He talked about this thing about 1991 when we sort of decided at that time that, in fact, it was for our own survival that we really needed to whatever we made, we needed to make such that we would be competitive as though there was zero duty. And actually for our product line, the duties actually came down very, very rapidly. Within, I would say, Nausha, wouldn't you say, I think in about 5 years or so after 1991, rates of duty for most of our products were
Pretty well
in
zero.
the, sorry?
Pretty well zero.
Yeah, pretty well zero.
Yeah.
And actually that was the best thing which happened, really. It was really the best thing that happened because it forced us to be competitive. It forced us to differentiate. That means whatever we did, we needed to make sure that our R&D was in some way differentiating. Now, not to say that, you know, we're absolutely successful with that because it's a mindset, and particularly with your sales people. Your salespeople want to sell things that they see what competition is doing, and then that sort of feeds ideas for development. And we sometimes have to push back hard on that, because if you do that, what you're doing is that you are trying to develop something, starting development on something, which will take maybe a year or two, develop something which someone else, your competitor, has today. Okay. And then what happens then is that what's driving that, the decision to drive that is purely price competitiveness. And Janak talked about that one of the things that Indian manufacturing firms are doing and what's driving them is to be price competitive. And what Naushad and I push back very strongly on that, because if price is your only differentiator, okay, that is usually a very short-lived differentiator. And also to achieve that price competitiveness and being successful only on price means you have to have huge scale to be competitive. So instead, if we look at our own skill sets are where we can add knowledge to an existing product or even a manufacturing process, and where we can actually provide a value add benefit to the customer, which differentiates us from competition. So that is what tends to drive our R&D work. Now, having said that, I think there's also one other element here, and that is you need to have good manufacturing processes as well. And for this, we have actually ourselves benefited a great deal from our joint venture partners. And whereas, you know, the joint venture has been set up primarily initially to serve the Indian market, but we have been able to learn very good manufacturing techniques from the joint venture partner. And now what's happening is that in the manufacturing process, we have been able to also innovate, and there's actually a reverse flow now happening of what we are doing in our manufacturing processes, which is now going back to the partner. So it's not in everything, but I think we are now at a level where we, at least for this one particular joint venture, which I'm talking about, is with a German company in instrumentation, and where we are actually doing things here for robotic manufacturing, etc., and where the partner is now actually applying those same processes in their process and using our vendor who we've developed here for that robotic process. So I'll just stop at that. Yeah.
No, thank you very much. I think it's one thing which just comes out so strongly is, you know, manufacturing competitiveness of a nation is built by competitiveness of firms.
Yeah.
And I think unless the firms change, and your example that you gave is just exactly that, and there's so many things that come out of it. Let me get back to host of questions and comments which are there, and some very interesting ones. And so we'll start with you, Nandita. You've been reading them. The questions from Megha from Lewis University.
Yeah.
You know, you've read that, I guess.
Yes.
Benefit of others. And there's a related question from Rakesh and as well. So you might as well want to take it. The question is on the method. An alternative hypothesis could be that firms diversify risk through diversifying product lines.
Yeah.
And then Megha says that you must also control for size, as larger firms will be mechanically more complex and diversified. They over to you.
Thank you so much, Megha, for the question. Nice to see that you also come from Louis University. A lot of previous colleagues are there. So we should also drop a line to catch up and discuss further. So I see your question. So there have been a lot of works historically, that was discussing diversification. Is diversification a risk minimization effort by firms or not? And empirical evidence actually shows the opposite. And actually, the hypothesis is not supported by several empirics. First of all, then we would see diversification with similar shares, no? But this is not the case in the sense, or not firms diversify in all the products in the same way. It's shown by Goldberg, Khandelwal paper. It's shown also by our paper. And second, we would also see incoherent diversification. So this article that I post here is very interesting, and this exactly makes this point by Giulio and Angelo. They look at the diversification patterns, and they actually show that this is not really a risk minimization event. Oh, sorry, I think I put this privately to Pankaj instead of. Okay, yes, now I pasted the work. So it's an interesting question. There have been a lot of work on this, and it's very interesting, this work, because whichever country you apply this, the results are this. So these are things that we can start making, I don't know, theoretical models, and we can start believing in them, since there's so much of empirical regularity within for different countries on this, that diversification is not really a risk minimization event by firms. And yeah, we do actually control for the size. And shall I just go to the next question?
Yeah, please. Might as well. Yeah. I mean, there are a couple of questions on diversification, so you can take.
Yeah, exactly. I could. Yeah.
Sanjoy and Megha.
So, on the policy, yeah, you need to remember that we do have sector and time dummies. So the policies that affect all the firms in pharmaceutical sector, we don't have to consider, because this would already get washed away in our estimation. And the question by Professor Rakesh is extremely interesting, and this is exactly something that we checked. And one of other, Giovanni, was quite sure that the results would be different. But actually, for the conglomerate nature of the firm, didn't actually didn't change the results much. So we did a separate analysis. This could be also because of the fact that there are many firms that do not work in a conglomerate structure. So maybe we have to think of other methodologies that can consider this, but actually it did not change much our results on the relatedness or coherence measure. And Megha, yeah, you're right. I mean, it could also be that firms are diversifying along the value chain to reduce costs, but still if it's a new activity to the firm, the argument that we make still holds. I see another question in the Indian scenario, where medium and small enterprises dominate the manufacturing sector. How do you see diversification playing out? It's an interesting question. Actually, clearly, I mean, size is an important driver, but and this is also part of the issue, right? To grasp organizational capability. So, as if we look at the work by the World Bank, Sirera and Malini, as they say, we need to climb up the capability ladder, and it's possible that many of the firms are in the lower steps, are the MSMEs that do not have the organizational capabilities. And I think this is part of the problem. And this is why we cannot extend, or we cannot move to more complex products, or we cannot have a competitive edge. This could be one of the reasons why we see this, these, let's say, overall issues with the manufacturing. Getting to the question on by Professor Rakesh again, Yeah, it could be interesting to also look at interactions. We didn't actually check that here. And complementary, yes, that's true. It is possible that there are complementary linkages, even though I do not, we don't exactly see the separate effects. Thanks for the question by Anurag. Anurag asked, were you able to look at the temporal nature of firm diversification? Did they occur at a certain point when policy changes occur, or the firms had sufficient profitability or sufficient number of years of R&D? Thank you so much, Anurag, for the question. So the point of the paper on the second point is exactly this, in the sense that diversification happens in specific moments. In the same way I gave the example of paracetamol, you take paracetamol when you have fever. Diversification happens when there is a low growth potential, and this is exactly why we need to control for this. We need to take into account this factor in the empirical strategy to understand the effect of diversification on performance. And the question on policy changes at a specific time, we do have time dummies, so this in a way should take care of this. We did actually also look at short versus long-term effect, and we didn't have any changes with the results, and likely we added this as a footnote or in the paper. The question by I try to quickly go through the questions. The question by Professor Ragesh is extremely interesting, using the dummy instead of R&D expenditure. So usually when we present works on R&D expenditures, people start asking, yeah, but how much can you trust these values? Look at the WBS surveys. I mean, the firms that say that they do and what they actually do are different, etc., etc. So while it is possible that the values could have issues, I don't think a firm will set up an R&D lab just to get subsidies, and so an R&D dummy is a much more of a bigger, let's say, reliable and usually acceptable measure, at least when I present this to the international crowd. I think more or less
There's one more, Nandita, just right at the end from Shadab Danish.
Yeah.
Just at the bottom, it says.
Yeah. So no, I'm trying to find the.
It says, let me read it for you. Yeah, I would like to know more about the ownership structure of the firms and the impact on diversification, followed by their profitability and firm growth in India. And then second, what is your thought if we use technological diversification based on 4-digit IPC code in place of diversification data, at the place of product diversification data?
Yeah. Very interesting question, Shadab. So I would take the two separate questions. On the technological diversification, we'll have to start looking at patterns, which are really few. And it's not only about the using, maybe you meant to use patterns to look at the technological diversification. Much of the R&D in developing countries are not patentable. It's about products that are new to the market. It's about processes and how we are able to absorb foreign technology and this. So I don't know how much how much important it is to look at technology diversification. And the other side, on the private versus public, I'll just share with you an interesting detail that I found. BHEL is the only firm in India that are producing these complex capital goods since years. And indeed, as you know, we have huge import of capital goods since a lot of time. At some point, moving up the ladder, we would expect that we also start producing some. So it is possible that it's, I would guess it's kind of a strategic dependence, no? As you call it, as the European Commission call it. They have the strategic dependence. So they start producing something by the public sector. So BHEL actually produced some of these complex capital goods. And interestingly enough, likely it did help some of the domestic firms, but no other firms have taken it up. It's only for the only enterprise that is making those products. So indeed, it in a way plays a role, and but irrespective of it's public or private, it really depends on the innovative capabilities, be it public or private. BHEL does it because BHEL has the capabilities to do it. So one thing that might come is the profitability. So it is possible that public firms could still do it, even if it is not profitable for them at the beginning. They could think about long-term profitability. But other than that, it all boils down to the innovative capabilities of firm, irrespective of public or private.
Okay, thank you, Nandita. If there's some more, we'll kind of come back to you, or you jump in if there's some other things that your model starts to tell as far as findings from Janak's survey is concerned. Janak, Reggie Joseph is asking, what is your understanding on why firms in India do not find competition from China as an issue of concern? I know you raised this, but I think it's important to kind of underline the reason, or at least the hypothesis that you have.
Sure. So, and there was another question somebody asked about, is it possible that the top management weren't even aware of the competition from China? I mean, that's likely. I mean, the policymakers who've not really been aware of the data that, these imports have been rising over time. Of course, now it's center stage and people are more aware of it. But coming back to Reggie's question, Reggie, so what we felt was that, there were two things. Either they were in segments which, so if you break down the 70 billion of imports that are coming in from China right now, they're largely in electronics, electrical equipment, about 35-40% of that. And you didn't really find, significant presence, whether in R&D or otherwise, till the new push that's been introduced in this particular sector. So it's quite likely that firms, that the product segment that the Chinese are in is something which, we're not currently in right now. And secondly, the intermediate goods, so the inputs into the APIs for the pharmaceutical industry or even the auto component manufacturers, a lot of them depend on imports from China. So it's quite likely that they weren't competing with the Chinese firms, but the competition domestically was all using inputs coming in from China. So those are two things that we felt were, possibilities here.
Sanjay Mukherjee asked this question: why are Indian firms not adopting manufacturing 4.0 practice at a rapid pace? I mean, this is showing from your practice-related priorities that they show up in your survey.
So, as I mentioned, the survey was prior to the pandemic, and even before that, it's perhaps just awareness around this, the use of IoT and how it works within a company. And, a lot of consulting firms are making a big push for it. I know industry associations that are setting up centers to really train and promote awareness around these technologies. So clearly there's a lack of understanding perhaps in what these technologies can do for you. And also till I don't know if it's like, you see 10 people doing it and then you say, okay, now it's working, so let me also do it. So maybe you're waiting for, someone to first take that investment, see it work, and then perhaps follow through with your own investments in that. So
may I quickly add sorry. Yeah, when we talk about Industry 4.0, I think when we discuss in India, they say, look, we are not yet doing it, so it's fine. But no, in the sense, if you, depending on your position in the value chain, if the West have so quickly adopted and pandemic naturally triggered a lot to digitalize and everything, this would affect also Indian firms, depending on which is the position which position we take in the global value chain. And also there have been a lot of works recently at the World Bank that talk about a lot in the heterogeneity in the technology adoption. And this is where institutes like you can contribute, because you can do surveys and try to help us understand exactly this. So how can we upskill people? How can we, which are the digital skills that you miss? Which are the skills that you miss to adopt these new technologies? Right, this is the most soon enough pressing question, because if we are part of the value chain and then reshoring starts, because the West is not going to wait. So I think this is interesting to know why there is this heterogeneity in technology adoption between firms, why they are not adopting, or is it because they don't have the skills? I mean, what matters? Is it the share of techies in the firm? I mean, all these, I think you have a lot to contribute as an institute in this respect.
No, and you find that a lot of, I think, Indian tech firms are actually doing cutting edge stuff, right? So you will find that they're doing it for markets outside India, where it's phenomenal, just the interactive softwares that you can have within a firm to improve productivity, or even sort of chatbots that can be set up to, respond to customer requirements and complaints. But you talk to these firms and they're doing it. So there's obviously some disconnect, and it seems it's not a new story, right? There's always been that disconnect between what the IT industry does and what it can do, and the adoption in the automotive sector here, for example, or
yeah, it could also be a bit, if you ask a bit more detailed, is it Internet of Things? Is it AI? Is it big data? Or is it additive manufacturing? Then they might get it. I mean, in the sense, maybe they're doing it, but they don't know that they're doing it. So it could also be a matter of framing it.
terminology.
Yeah, yeah.
Janak, there's a related question in the same genre that Samir is asking. I mean, he asked earlier who were the respondents, were they top managers themselves? But coming to the issue of practices, he also says lack of decentralization in idea generation may be possibly be because of declining interest in Japanese manufacturing philosophies like TPM, TQM, and others, although it's much easier to share and replicate them nowadays. And there is it's a good question, because is there fatigue setting in on some of the shop floor innovation practices in India? Because for almost a decade and a half, this was really the talk of the town, right?
So at least in the survey, it doesn't seem to suggest that they are not laying emphasis on these. What we highlighted were, the more sort of standard practices, like the certification to the quality standards of customers and things like that. But firms are also paying attention to the normal Japanese philosophies as well. It's not like they've ignored TQM or TPM and things like that.
Okay, so let's see. Now, Raghu Rao at IIT Madras has an interesting comment. He says, I cannot name any product built on Indian R&D that has scaled up to achieve a sales revenue of 1,000 crores. Indian companies have scaled products built on foreign technology. Where does the problem really lie? Do Indian firms find it better to import the R&D technology than use Indian R&D? Or is it Indian R&D just not good enough? Or is there some other question embedded in here? We should ask a different question altogether. I mean, what?
So, we've looked at, of course, as I mentioned, the import of capital goods that has been slowing, but there's also import of through technology payments data, and that has been increasing over time. The only thing is when you break that down, it's not very clear if it's what that technology actually is. Is it really towards more the copyrights and other intellectual property payments for the entertainment industry? So it could be that overall sort of technology and innovation spending is not really happening to the extent that one would. Again, it comes down to the data that we have access to, and it's very important that we try and push for this kind of data. So we were able to put it together for our first handbook, which came out in 2019, technology payments at firm level. But when we tried to do it for the second handbook, which came out a couple of months ago, it was so difficult that we just gave up. We said, it's just very, very difficult to get this data.
Let me push you a little bit. Do you want to speculate what might be possible reasons therein? Because it's an interesting question. Does it have to do with price competition, but then shop floor innovation should happen? Does it have to do with technology import, or does it have to do with some other policy element which is not driving us? Where is the incentive? Why is the incentive?
It's an interesting question, because I think, if you look at like a lot of our industry leaders, everyone has been to a top like US university, whether it's MIT or any of these universities, right? But somehow, like, I don't know, it's historically that we've just been focused on the quarter to quarter results, and maybe that's something which is so ingrained that it's only now. So even if you talk about joint ventures, of course, Farhad gave a very good example of how it's now worked the other way. But, for companies that had this buying spree in 2009 onwards, it's very difficult to know what that technology flow back was. So even you take Tata Motors and the acquisition of Jaguar, like it's taken many, many years for that to actually develop into something today. I think I don't know if there was immediate tech transfer that was happening, even though this massive buyout that happened. So it's
no, maybe Naushad can answer this one. Are we talking about 1,000 crore? And because we have tech companies that are crossing this valuation and things so rapidly. Is manufacturing reaching these scales through manufacturing that much more difficult than other sectors?
I've been thinking about, ever since I read that question in the chat, I've been trying to think of at least one example, of 1,000 crore products, of a single product. Probably you could pick the only ones that you could pick would be the auto sector products. Those would be obvious. And maybe there are some pharma products that I don't know of. Because I'm not too familiar with which name, which product, etc. But then there should be some, I would have thought. I would also say that there are probably some specialty chemical products, which would be intermediate products, and that would show up in different, which show up in exports and in sales in India as intermediate inputs into other products. There are companies like Aarti Industries and others, SRF, a few others that are United Phosphorus, that are very successful specialty chemical companies. So if we actually search, we might well find those 1,000 crore plus products. I think we'd find them in Tata Motors, in Mahindra's, in Ashok Leyland, I would guess. We should find them in Bajaj Auto for particular motorcycles. So I think we would find them, but we'll have to look. It's a good question, and it's a good prompt to actually find them. But on the technology import versus R&D question, it's an old question, and on what is the role of imports and local effort, and how does the balance work? And I think the most convincing analysis I've seen says that imports and local effort are not substitutes for each other. They are complements, and they should be seen as complements. So in other words, it's not that you decide whether to import technology or to invest in in-house R&D. It's how technology intensive do you wish to be as a firm? what are your technological aspirations? And in fact, what they've generally, I think, found, and this is true not just of Indian firms, but worldwide, that the firms that actually import a lot of technology tend to do a lot of R&D, so they tend to go together.
Could I just mention something, Pankaj, if you don't mind?
Yes, please.
If you look at, maybe you don't have the 1,000 crores, but if you look at Germany, and you look at the Mittelstand companies, many of these are family owned, and they are very innovative. They do a lot of, innovative work. And they don't necessarily have, there are some which are huge. I mean, there are, very successful, very large companies as well. But many are actually medium-sized companies, but highly innovative, and highly differentiated in what they offer as well. And I wonder, I think in India, if we have more of an opportunity to do that sort of scale, but still with innovation and with differentiation. So just a comment.
I think what an important point. I mean, Japan is so much like that as well. Rakesh has a very good and sage comment. Rakesh says, the World Bank Enterprise Survey shows that the proportion of firms doing R&D in India is lower than proportion that reports innovation. A large proportion report new to the firm innovation, but a significant percentage also report new to the market. Are we being overcritical? It will be useful to check this out from the data. And I think a very good point. So Janak, this is homework for you. Let's see. Okay, Sunil Kanwar. Sunil wanted to, you can unmute, you want to ask your question. So please do.
Am I audible?
Yes, yeah.
Thanks a lot, Pankaj. Janak, I'll raise a couple of issues here,
Sure.
short ones. So the first one has to do with your slide. This is sources of innovation ideas. I looked at those and I found that what was intriguing was that universities were missing from that as sources of ideas. That's quite interesting because it squares up with the fact that there is very little university industry interlinkage as far as research goes. So when I look around at colleagues, projects, etc., in different institutions, I'll find that yes, they take up projects from international institutions, the UN and the World Bank, etc., and from the government of India, but very few, proportionately speaking, from industry. What are the reasons on both sides which prevent this? Because universities are a hotbed of ideas, and I think this should be an important source of innovation ideas. That's one issue that I want to raise. And the second one has to do with your slide titled Activities you wrote involved in innovation. I think what you wanted to say was activities involving innovation. My short question out here is, what percentage of the 403 firms that you worked with had a dedicated research lab and or a dedicated R&D division? This question comes up because one of my students who looked at, who actually went to individual companies to collect R&D, etc. data, found that many of them don't even have R&D managers, and she had to talk to just ordinary managers to eke out whatever information. So that information would also be helpful.
Okay.
Sure. So thanks, Sunil. Great to have you here. So in the first question on the slide is actually on the sources of innovative ideas within a company. But I do agree that there's very little industry academia collaboration that does happen. You can see it in number of data, whether it's publications or even patent applications and things like that. We did this exercise for firms that actually were doing, so even in our data, just to take a step back, when we looked at, we asked how many of your firms, how many are actually publishing any articles in journals and things? That's very little of that happening. Just about 30% of firms said that they had some sort of publications. But a couple of years ago, we had actually looked at the top Indian spenders in the list of the 2,500 global R&D spenders list, and we had looked at their publications on Web of Science. And although they're not significant contributions coming from these sectors, whether it's industrial metals or mining or even the auto sector and pharmaceuticals, you do find that those that are actually engaging in scientific research are publishing alongside with universities. So there was a high share of that collaboration happening. It's just that there's not enough of it happening. And I would think that these collaborations, in a way, we've done some work again on university academia collaborations. And a lot of it, I think, also has to do with who gets the funding, who controls the patenting. These are kind of issues which have often been barriers for successful collaborations. So funding, for example, something like the PM Fellowship program, at least a few years ago, was often, I think, after a student had been assigned to a professor who was already working on a particular project, was when the fellowship would be assigned to the student, and by then it was too late for any kind of industry collaboration. So I think it's also how this funding actually is planned and who controls it. Most of the time, I think it's also there's some, especially if it's government funding, there's somehow trust needs to be developed that industry can manage this funding too. I just feel that it's off the cater that funding, the university incentives of the researchers may be very different from what the industry needs are. For the second question, I think we did ask this question about R&D units, and almost about 60% of them claim to have independent R&D units. So out of the 403. So, but again, because for example, and one of the questions here in terms of driving innovation we have is it helped to have access to tax incentives for R&D and things like that, and especially firms that were profitable or had seen increased market share did say that they did benefit from these kind of tax incentives. So and we know that to avail of any of these tax incentives, you had to have an independent R&D unit for DSIR. So yeah.
Okay,
Great.
Let me just take the last question for you, Janak, and it says, Senthil from Amrita School of Business says, where does innovation in Indian manufacturing firms heading in the value chain, high end or low end? I'm sure you have an answer.
I think maybe you should answer this or get Naushad to answer it again. But I think typically the argument often is that it's probably in the low end more than the high. The output that, although I know and Naushad, you should come in because we've written about the structure of manufacturing, how it's skill and capital intensive, but it's not really in terms of the high end value chain. So I don't know if you'd like to add something to that, Naushad.
Sure, I'll just add, just picking up on what you mentioned. There is, if you look at Indian manufacturing, the structure of Indian manufacturing is that we, for a country with a $2,000 per capita GDP, we have a manufacturing structure that is more skill and capital intensive than almost any other country with a $2,000, roughly $2,000 per capita GDP. We have actually an industrial structure that is more skill and capital intensive than China with $10,000 per capita GDP. So the point is that if you have a skill and capital intensive industrial structure, then unless you invest in R&D in a very substantial way, you're not going to be present in the most attractive segments. And I mean, I don't have any basis for saying this beyond it just being a hypothesis, but I wonder whether this very interesting finding in the STIER survey of, that firms do not see China as a significant competitor. I mean, it's a striking finding, right? And the question is why? And I wonder if it's because, well, the sectors that China is competitive in are more technology intensive. They invest in the technology, and Indian firms have either not gone into those sectors or found it too difficult and so abandoned them. And I would worry about that and try to get at exactly why, because and maybe look at it, sector by sector and sort of say, what's the story in specialty chemicals? What's the story in auto components? What's the story in pharmaceuticals? And really try to get at what's going on there.
And
I'd like to just add.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Sorry, after you. No, I wanted to show this chart. No, after you, because I want to show this particular graph which is in the appendix. It's a chart in the appendix on
I don't want
the
to,
top
no,
sectors on R&D.
Sure. I didn't want to leave.
So I'm not going to add.
I didn't want to leave everybody on a very down note. I said India also surprises everybody.
Yeah.
Every now and then you go into a plant and you'll see such an amazing innovation that it just blows your mind off. So I think we are a country of contrast in every which way.
Yeah, if I could I just build on what you said, Pankaj. For us in India, I think it's an aggregate question.
Yeah.
Right? We have great performing firms that do everything right. Our challenge is making that the median firm experience.
Yeah.
And we have to think of what policies will do to make it the median firm experience, and we have to think of what firm ambition and industrial structures will do to make it the median firm experience.
So true. Janak, you want to put something up and go ahead?
No, just Vaishnavi, if you could show that slide, because I think to that in terms of it's the data from our handbook on the sector-wise, right? So this actually captures it's industrial R&D of the top 10 sectors globally. And, this is something which we've been tracking over time. And if you look at, for example, Chinese firms, right? They're there in every top sector of wherever there's any R&D spending happening. So it's whether it's pharmaceuticals, software, technology, hardware, electronics, name it. Indian firms are possibly present in maybe 2 or 3 of these sectors, right? And I think somebody had asked this question about, are we more competitive in pharmaceuticals and Chinese are more, where it concerns costs and things like that. But the Chinese are then every top R&D sector, right? And the interesting thing is that just in a couple of years, you've seen the number of Chinese firms increase from like 300 to over 500 in the top 2,500 list, right? And the US firms have declined from like maybe about 750 to 600 or odd. Indian firms have remained stagnant, like 20, 30, 25 to 30 is the maximum that makes an appearance, whether you look at the data 3 years ago or even today. And partly, I think it touches upon something which Ambuj and even Ambuj had talked about, right? The investments started, or the planning for this dominance on the technology front by the Chinese began many years ago. And this is now playing out and actually they're being rewarded for it. But it's just a very different story in terms of their focus. Also to bring back Sunil Kanwar's point about universities. There's a lot of investments in higher education. To work at these universities. So I suppose there are a lot of things that we could also pick up on in terms of what needs to be done going forward from here. I just wanted to showcase this data point really, just in terms of how they're present in not just a few sectors, but really dominate, every sector that there is to compete in.
No, it's a very good slide. Thank you, Janak. Let me just bring this conversation to a closure. We're at 8 p.m. Just want to make two quick points here. Maybe Indian manufacturing structure and nature ought to be unique to itself rather than what China does elsewhere, so long as our effectiveness is very high. And an example is, whether our small and large firms are strategically positioned appropriately in the Indian manufacturing ecosystem. The role of small globally is largely around being highly innovative, producing different kind of products, serving customers that are very varied, and at the same point of time being extremely innovative. But we see just the opposite of that in a country where small really want to be single product producers, where they just don't have any cost advantage vis-a-vis a large firm. So somewhere there's a strategic positioning issue also that needs to be explored. And second is the point that Farhad made very, very well. Indian manufacturing, in my mind, its strength lies in its magical middle. The mid-sized firm in India are really perhaps the most innovative. They are the ones who've grown from small to large, to mid-size. They've been innovative, hence they've come to mid-size. They have absolutely top-end technological processes. They're very exciting in terms of the kind of manufacturing processes that they adopt and implement. And by the virtue that they've gone from small to mid-size means that this is the most dynamic stage of the firm. And I think Indian policy must look at trying to see how to move more firms from small to mid-size. And that transition would be a very exciting transition. And a third point, which Naushad, you also mentioned regarding, this is about training and skills. We have mechanical engineers and electrical engineers, etc., but we really don't have the good old-fashioned manufacturing engineers or industrial engineers in the kind of numbers that are needed to be able to do process innovation in a very big way. And you increasingly find programs that are engineering science oriented. And as a result, perhaps we find companies hiring more folks who are diploma engineers rather than the degree ones, and there's a limit to their knowledge investment over a period of time. So somewhere we've gotten locked into many of these characteristics, and I think this conversation, these presentations today were just absolutely fascinating to throw lights on many of these issues. Thank you, Nandita. Thank you, Janak. But also, I think we need to bring to closure this wonderful conference over the last four days. Thank you all of you who attended this. I mean, having 100+ people coming on fourth day is no mean task, and I think thank you and for your interest in keeping this conversation alive. It's my pleasure to thank the speakers, Ashish Arora, Nick Bloom, Akash Kalyani, Chirantan Chatterjee, Mehul Tombak, Santosh Sahu, Abhishek Malhotra, and to you, Nandita and Janak. Thank you so much. Rakesh, Naushad, and Ambush, thank you for chairing these sessions. I think they were just excellent. CTIER has been a fabulous, I think, center for leading many of these conversations and raising these issues, which no one else is doing in this way in this country. And I'm quite sure with your support, Naushad and Farhad, CTIER is going to, I think, play a very significant role in this domain in times to come. Also, I think this conference was made possible because of lots of people who are working behind the scene, Dipti Singhania, Vaishnav Dande, Anurag Anand, Madhuraj Deka, Rohan, Tanvi, and Danish. Thank you all tremendously for putting this conference in such a seamless manner. And I think we hope to do this more often and perhaps hopefully both online as well as in person. Online has an advantage to be able to get many more people than what on campus or on site does. So thank you once again, and such a pleasure to have you. And good night for today.